What if the deadliest decision in American history was made by a man who simply refused to cancel a parade? The year is 1918, September 28th, a Saturday morning in Philadelphia. Dr. Wilmer Krusen, the city's health director, stands at his office window. Outside, 200,000 people are gathering for the largest parade in the city's history. They will march down Broad Street to celebrate liberty, to sell war bonds, to show patriotism. Krusen knows the flu is coming. He has seen the reports from Boston. He has read about soldiers dying by the hundreds at Camp Devens. But the war needs money. The parade must go on. He watches the crowds assemble, shoulder to shoulder, breath to breath, and he says nothing. Within 72 hours, every hospital bed in Philadelphia will be full. Within 6 weeks, 12,000 people will be dead. And Krusen will spend the rest of his life wondering if a single word from him could have saved them. This is the story of the Spanish flu. Not just how it killed, but how one choice, one parade, one moment of hesitation changed everything. To understand the catastrophe, you must first understand the confidence. 1918 was not the Dark Ages. This was the modern world. Electric lights, automobiles, telephones, airplanes had conquered the sky. Scientists had conquered disease. Consider the miracles of the previous 50 years. Louis Pasteur had proven that germs caused illness. Joseph Lister had invented antiseptic surgery. Robert Koch had identified the bacteria behind tuberculosis, cholera, and anthrax. Vaccines existed for smallpox, rabies, typhoid. For the first time in human history, doctors understood why people got sick, and that understanding bred certainty. According to the National Archives, American life expectancy had climbed from 39 years in 1880 to 54 years by 1917. Infant mortality had plummeted. The great plagues of the past seemed conquered. Medicine had entered its golden age. But this confidence had a fatal flaw. Doctors believed they understood influenza. They were wrong. The medical consensus in 1918 held that flu was caused by a bacterium called Pfeiffer's bacillus. Doctors had isolated it during the 1889 pandemic. They had developed vaccines against it. They were certain. They did not know that influenza was caused by a virus. They did not know viruses existed. The electron microscope that would reveal them would not be invented for another 13 years. So when a new kind of flu began spreading in the spring of 1918, doctors looked for bacteria. They found nothing. They treated patients with methods designed for bacterial infections. The treatments failed, and people died. The story begins not in Spain, but in Kansas. On the morning of March 4th, 1918, a young army cook named Albert Gitchell reported to the infirmary at Camp Funston. He had a sore throat, a fever, and a pounding headache. The camp doctor noted his symptoms and sent him to rest. By noon, over 100 soldiers had reported the same symptoms. By week's end, over 500 were sick. Camp Funston was part of Fort Riley, one of the largest military training facilities in America. 56,000 soldiers lived in barracks designed for half that number. They shared mess halls, latrines, and sleeping quarters. When one man coughed, dozens breathed the same air. The virus spread through the camp like water through sand. But the army had other priorities. The Great War demanded troops. So, even as soldiers fell sick, transports continued loading. Infected men boarded trains heading east to embarkation ports. They carried the virus to camps across America, then across the Atlantic to France. Meanwhile, the Great War had created the perfect delivery system. 4 million Americans in uniform, training camps packed beyond capacity, ships crossing the Atlantic carrying 10,000 men in spaces designed for 3,000. Trenches stretching 400 miles across Europe, where soldiers lived in mud and shared everything. Lice, rats, air, disease. On the Western Front, conditions were catastrophic. Soldiers huddled in narrow trenches, sometimes for weeks at a time. They slept in shifts, pressed together for warmth. Rats scurried over sleeping men. Lice infested every uniform. When the flu arrived, it tore through the trenches with terrifying speed. According to military records, the virus swept through France in May, then spread across the lines to Germany, Austria, and the Slavic nations to the east. Neither side could escape. Neither side could admit weakness. The first wave hit in spring. It was mild. Soldiers got sick for a few days, then recovered. Military planners noted it and moved on. The war was more important. Troop ships kept sailing, training continued, and with every transport, with every train, the virus spread wider. It also mutated, adapted, became something far more dangerous. Here is something most people never learned. The pandemic became known as the Spanish flu, but it did not start in Spain. Spain was neutral in the war. Its newspapers faced no military censorship. When the flu arrived, Spanish journalists reported it openly. They wrote about King Alfonso XIII falling ill. They published death tolls. They warned the public. Meanwhile, the warring nations suppressed the news. In Britain, the Defense of the Realm Act allowed the government to kill stories that might hurt morale. Sir Arthur Newsholme, the chief medical officer, suggested it was unpatriotic to worry about flu when soldiers were dying in France. In Germany, General Erich Ludendorff watched the virus devastate his troops, but forbade any public acknowledgement. He feared the Allies would learn of his army's weakness and attack. So the world read about Spanish deaths, while deaths in France, Britain, Germany, and America went unreported. The flu became Spanish, not because it started there, but because Spain was the only country honest enough to admit it was happening. The second wave arrived in late August. It began in the port cities: Brest in France, Freetown in Sierra Leone, Boston in America. This wave was different. This wave killed. In Boston, sailors at the Commonwealth Pier began collapsing on August 27th. By September 8th, the disease had reached Camp Devens, a military base 30 miles west of the city. What happened there would become a warning that Philadelphia ignored. If you're learning something new from this story, consider subscribing. We uncover the forgotten chapters of history every week. Camp Devens held 50,000 soldiers in facilities designed for 36,000. When the flu arrived, it spread like wildfire through gasoline. On September 8th, a few dozen men reported sick. By September 16th, 6,600 soldiers were hospitalized. The base hospital, built for 1,200 patients, held over 6,000. Men lay on floors, in hallways, anywhere there was space. A physician named Roy wrote to a colleague, in a letter now preserved by PBS American Experience. "These men start with what appears to be an attack of la grippe or influenza," he wrote. "And when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most viscous type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones. A few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours then, until death comes. It is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible." Roy described watching over 100 men die every day. He wrote about bodies stacked in the morgue like cordwood. Special trains carried the dead away because there were not enough coffins. He wrote, "It beats any sight they ever had in France after a battle." This letter reached medical authorities. The warning was clear: the flu was coming. It was deadly, and it spread through crowds like nothing anyone had seen before. Philadelphia received this warning, and Philadelphia ignored it. Dr. Krusen faced an impossible choice. The 4th Liberty Loan Parade was scheduled for September 28th. The government needed to raise money for the war. Patriotism demanded participation. Canceling would hurt morale. It might even be seen as unpatriotic. So Krusen allowed the parade to proceed. 200,000 people lined Broad Street. They waved flags. They cheered soldiers. They breathed the same air. Many kissed. Many embraced. It was the largest parade in Philadelphia history. It was also a death sentence. Within 72 hours, every hospital in Philadelphia was overwhelmed. According to the University of Pennsylvania archives, the city would lose 12,000 people in 6 weeks. 47,000 reported cases in just 1 month. Bodies piled in homes because there were no coffins, no undertakers, no gravediggers left alive to bury them. The city requisitioned steam shovels to dig mass graves. The healthcare system collapsed almost immediately. Philadelphia had fewer than 31 nurses for every 10,000 residents. When the flu struck, those numbers became meaningless. Nurses fell sick at the same rate as everyone else. Doctors worked until they dropped. According to research published by the National Institutes of Health, the Great War had already created a severe civilian nursing shortage. 9,000 trained nurses had been sent overseas. Thousands more were assigned to military camps. When the pandemic exploded, there was almost no one left to care for the sick. The American Red Cross issued desperate appeals for volunteers. They lowered their standards dramatically. Anyone who had completed a basic home hygiene course and possessed 72 hours of hospital experience could volunteer. Many who answered the call had no medical training at all. They learned by doing. They learned by watching patients die. In Philadelphia, the death toll climbed so fast that the city ran out of places to put the bodies. Morgues overflowed. Undertakers worked around the clock until they too fell sick. Families kept corpses in their homes for days, unable to arrange burial. The stench of death hung over entire neighborhoods. City officials finally recruited volunteers to go door to door, collecting the dead like garbage collectors collecting trash. But here's what makes this story more than tragedy. Here's what makes it a lesson. 300 miles west, another city faced the same virus. St. Louis had received the same warnings from Boston. Their health commissioner was a man named Max Starkloff, and Starkloff made a different choice. 2 days before Philadelphia's parade, Starkloff closed every school, theater, church, and public gathering place in St. Louis. He banned public funerals. He staggered business hours to prevent crowding on streetcars. He ordered saloons closed. When people protested, he held firm. According to a 2007 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, researchers analyzed the death rates in both cities. Philadelphia's death rate from influenza peaked at 358 deaths per 100,000 people. St. Louis peaked at 158 per 100,000. Philadelphia's peak was more than twice as deadly. The timing of intervention mattered enormously. Philadelphia waited 14 days after detecting its first case before implementing any measures. St. Louis acted within 2 days. Those 12 days of hesitation cost thousands of lives. The comparison became a foundational study in public health. Cities that acted early and aggressively had dramatically lower death rates. Cities that waited, that prioritized commerce or morale or war bonds over public safety, paid in bodies. But understanding why this flu killed requires understanding who it killed. Because the Spanish flu inverted everything doctors thought they knew about disease. Normal influenza kills the very young and the very old, the weak, the vulnerable. This flu killed the strong, men and women in their 20s and 30s, athletes, soldiers. Healthy pregnant women died at catastrophic rates. People who had never been sick collapsed within hours. Modern research has explained why. According to studies published in the journal PLOS1, the 1918 virus triggered what scientists now call a cytokine storm. The immune system, strongest in healthy young adults, detected the virus and responded with overwhelming force. It flooded the lungs with fluid, too much fluid, faster than the body could clear it. Victims literally drowned in the fluid their own immune systems produced. The stronger your immune system, the faster it killed you. This explains the horrifying speed of death. People would feel fine at breakfast and be dead by dinner. A woman in Cape Town boarded a streetcar feeling normal. 6 miles later, she was dead in her seat. Soldiers dropped during parade formation. Factory workers collapsed at their machines. It also explains one of the cruelest ironies. The measures meant to protect society often spread the disease faster. Churches held prayer services for the sick. The faithful gathered, breathed together, and infected each other. Funerals brought mourning families together. Those families carried the virus home. Everywhere people gathered in hope, the virus found new victims. The pandemic reached every corner of the world. It followed trade routes, shipping lanes, railway lines. It crossed oceans and climbed mountains. It found villages that had never seen an automobile, and cities with millions of people. Nowhere was safe. India suffered the worst national toll. According to the BBC, between 17 and 18 million Indians died, more than the entire death toll of the Great War. The British colonial government prioritized military logistics over public health. Medical supplies flowed to the Western Front, while Indian cities had no medicine, no doctors, no support. In Western Samoa, the flu arrived on November 4th, aboard a ship called the Talloon. Within weeks, according to records preserved by New Zealand History, 22% of the population was dead, 8,500 people. The colonial administration had failed to implement quarantine. Meanwhile, neighboring American Samoa, where the U.S. Navy enforced strict maritime quarantine, recorded 0 deaths. The difference between life and death was often a single decision: a quarantine enforced or ignored, a parade held or canceled, a ship allowed to dock or turned away. In Alaska, a tiny village called Brevig Mission received the virus in November. According to the New York Times, 72 of the village's 80 residents died within 5 days, 90% of the population, gone in less than a week. The 8 survivors were mostly children who watched their entire community die around them. Decades later, a Swedish scientist named Johan Holten would travel to Brevig Mission. In 1997, he exhumed bodies preserved in permafrost and extracted lung tissue samples. Those samples allowed researchers at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology to sequence the virus genome. In 2005, they published the complete genetic code. The killer finally had a name: H1N1, with genes of avian origin, a bird flu that had jumped to humans and learned to spread between them. Back in 1918, no one knew any of this. They only knew people were dying, and they could not stop it. The virus ripped through social fabric as efficiently as it ripped through lungs. Neighbors stopped helping neighbors. Families fractured. Fear replaced trust. In Philadelphia, according to the American Journal of Pediatrics, the pandemic created thousands of orphans almost overnight. Parents died within hours of each other, leaving children alone with the bodies. Neighbors were too afraid to help. In New York City alone, the 3 deadliest months produced 21,000 new orphans. Pennsylvania reported 45,000. Children wandered streets looking for parents who would never return. The orphan crisis revealed something terrible about how quickly society can unravel. Schools converted into hospitals. Churches became morgues. Normal life simply stopped. Stores closed because owners were dead or dying. Garbage piled in streets because collectors were sick. Factories shut down because workers could not come. The infrastructure of daily life, taken for granted until the moment it disappeared, simply collapsed under the weight of bodies. October 1918 became the deadliest month in American history. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 195,000 Americans died in those 31 days, more than 6,000 per day. The National Archives records that the pandemic lowered average American life expectancy by 12 years in a single year, from 54 years to 42. And then, as suddenly as it came, it faded. The third wave in winter was less deadly than the second. By spring of 1919, the pandemic had largely burned itself out. The virus had run out of vulnerable hosts. Those who would die had died. Those who survived had immunity. The final death toll remains uncertain. The CDC estimates at least 50 million worldwide. Some historians suggest the true number exceeded 100 million. In the United States, 675,000 died, more than American combat deaths in World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. 43,000 American soldiers died, not from enemy bullets, but from the virus. Nearly half of all U.S. military deaths in Europe came from influenza, not combat. But the story does not end with counting the dead. The Spanish flu changed the world in ways we still live with today. Before 1918, public health was an afterthought. Cities had no coordinated disease surveillance. Governments had no pandemic plans. The word quarantine existed, but the infrastructure to implement it did not. After 1918, everything changed. Cities established health departments with real authority. States created disease reporting requirements. The federal government expanded the public health service. The very concept of epidemiology, the science of tracking how diseases spread, emerged from the ashes of this pandemic. The comparison between Philadelphia and St. Louis became a founding document of modern public health. It proved that intervention works, that timing matters, that the choices leaders make in the first days of an outbreak determine how many die. Dr. Wilmer Krusen, the man who approved the Philadelphia parade, served as health director until 1920. He never publicly acknowledged his role in the disaster, but the lesson of his hesitation echoed through the decades. When the next pandemic came, public health officials would remember Philadelphia. They would remember what happens when you choose parades over precaution. In 2020, when COVID-19 emerged, epidemiologists immediately referenced the 1918 pandemic. They pulled out the St. Louis versus Philadelphia study. They warned about the cost of delay. History did not repeat exactly, but it rhymed. The sites of the 1918 pandemic remain. Camp Devens is now Fort Devens, still an active military installation. Camp Funston still exists within Fort Riley, where a small memorial marks the place where Albert Gitchell became the first recorded case. The mass graves of Philadelphia lie beneath modern neighborhoods. In Brevig Mission, Alaska, a memorial marks the village that lost 90% of its people in 5 days. And in laboratories around the world, researchers continue studying the 1918 virus, not as history, as warning. Because influenza viruses continue to mutate, bird flus continue to jump species. The next pandemic is not a question of if, but when. So what did we learn? We learned that confidence can kill, that the certainty of experts means nothing against a virus they do not understand. We learned that transparency saves lives. The wartime censorship of 1918, the refusal to alarm the public, cost millions. We learned that early action matters more than perfect information. St. Louis acted with uncertainty and saved lives. Philadelphia waited for certainty and filled mass graves. We learned that the systems connecting us can become highways for death. Trade routes, shipping lanes, troop transports. The same infrastructure that builds prosperity can spread plague. And we learned that when leaders choose denial over honesty, when they prioritize morale over medicine, the cost is measured not in reputation, but in human lives. But perhaps most importantly, we learned that we can endure. 50 million dead, life expectancy dropped by 12 years, cities paralyzed, social fabric torn, orphans wandering empty streets, and still, humanity rebuilt. We mourned our dead, cared for our orphans, and created systems to prevent it from happening again. The Spanish flu was not the first pandemic. It will not be the last, but it was the one that taught us how to fight back. The public health infrastructure that exists today, the disease surveillance, the pandemic preparedness plans, the very concept of flattening the curve, all of it traces back to the lessons of 1918. Dr. Roy, the physician who wrote from Camp Devens, ended his letter with a simple phrase, "God be with you till we meet again." He was writing to a friend, but he could have been writing to all of us. A message from the past to the future, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, connection matters, that bearing witness matters, that remembering matters. The dead of 1918 cannot speak, but their silence speaks volumes. It says, "We were here." It says, "This happened." It says, "Do not forget," because forgetting is how the next 50 million die. In the mass graves and frozen villages, in the archived letters and sequenced genomes, they rest, not as victims only, but as teachers. Their deaths purchase knowledge we cannot afford to waste. And in their memory we prepare, we watch, we learn. Because the next pandemic will come, and when it does, we will face it knowing what Philadelphia learned too late, and St. Louis proved beyond doubt. The choices we make in the first days determine everything. And that knowledge, bought with 50 million lives, is the only inheritance that matters.